Roger, we're back. We're
Indeed.
back for a gripping part 2 of the story of Lazarus. And it was an extraordinary picture in episode 21, wasn't it? This event of death is apparently going to lead to God being glorified. So the exact opposite of what mankind would think. And it's clearly got the disciples confused. But now we're actually going to see, what can Jesus actually do about death? So we're going to see him deal with his pal Lazarus. So let's turn over and get you reading us the story.
Yeah, well, it's great you say that, Richard, because the two biggest issues that we all face are the problem of sin and the issue of death. And nobody else outside of Jesus can deal with those. Anyway, let me read. After she'd said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here," she said, "and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who'd been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there.
So we start with this picture. If you remember rightly, we pick up the conversation that Martha had Lazarus's sister, while her sister Mary stayed at home. And now we get this pickup and great detail, eyewitness evidence detail of what's going on. So let's read the notes and unpack it. Jesus had said that through Lazarus's death, God would show more of who he is, his glory. More about his son, Jesus, would be revealed. He would be glorified, and that the disciples would grow in their faith. Well, as we read, let's ask ourselves, what do these events show us about Jesus' glory as God's Son? And how does this help us to believe? I think that's a really great principle, Roger. We can trust the gospel. We should treat it like we're in court. Okay, this is evidence. Do I believe it? Do I not believe it? Now, how does Mary respond when Jesus asks to see her? She immediately goes to meet him. And the mourners assume that she is off to the tomb, and so they follow. So we got the picture. Everybody's on their way out. They're coming to meet Jesus, who hasn't even got to the town yet. Let's turn over.
When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept.
Now, I find this is one of those pages which, again, I think people are going to seriously remember, because we've lost something actually in the use of English, which is there's much greater, deeper meaning when we go back into the original language with which this was written. Now, let's unpack it. First of all, in verse 32, Mary pitches up and she says exactly what her sister had said. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." So she knows that he had the ability to have stopped death occurring. Well, she should have known that, shouldn't she? She's been around, she's seen the miracles. It's obviously what the world now knows Jesus was capable of doing. But I want to get us into particularly looking at verses 33 through 35, because the language is so deep. How does Jesus react when he sees Mary's grief? He's deeply moved. Now, this is so much more than sadness. John wrote his gospel in Greek, and the same word was used when horses snort in rage as they go into battle. They're deeply moved. So there is a sense here of Jesus' anger at his friend's death. Imagine that. Imagine a war horse snorting. It's deeply moved when he sees the great weeping and the sorrow of those that have lost this friend and brother in Lazarus. And then verse 33 is even clearer. He's troubled. He's literally more churned up. Actually, the same word that is used here for troubled is used in Greek to describe the water at the bottom of a waterfall. You know that churned up mass of water that you get at the bottom of a waterfall? Yes, he's churned up. So he's angry at death, this imposter that was never intended. He's churned up by what this grief is causing. And in his humanity, his compassion, he's moved to tears. Now, that is so much more than we just read it. So could you just read it again? And I'm asking people as you read it, to imagine that depth of feeling, which clearly in the Greek is there with Jesus' behavior.
When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with him, her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept.
So there's a combination of anger and grief, and it shows both Jesus' humanity and his divinity. He's furious at death in God's world. He's stirred up at the hurt that death causes, and he's clearly genuine in his grief at the death of a friend. It's very moving. Right, let's see what he does.
Grief is very painful, but the fact that Jesus endured that pain speaks volumes about his love for us.
Yes, it does, doesn't it? So when we grieve, he is aware of grief. He knows what that is like. But he's also deeply moved. He's troubled, he's churned up by what was never intended, because mankind had walked away from God. We're living in a sinful, fallen world. Let's turn over and find out.
Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?"
So interesting conclusion of those around him, isn't it? They could see Jesus loved Lazarus, and yet we also get this query. They also wonder why Jesus didn't save him. If Jesus is God, then his reaction to the death of Lazarus also shows us what God is like. He is God of love, care, and concern. He shows compassion, including anger at death in the world. God understands when grief impacts us. God the Son wept at the graveside of his friend. But the question remains, can Jesus do anything about death? Now, Martha had raised the question back in verse 21, and Mary had repeated it. "Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died." Now the Jews asked the same question in verse 37. Well, tenterhooks, what's he going to do?
Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there's a bad odor, for he's been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?"
Now, writing was an expensive process in those days. You had to have it, scribe. It had to be put on a scroll. They were expensive. It was then copied, etc., etc. Detail. John is making sure that we've got the detail. This is eyewitness reporting so that we can believe. Well, let's see what the notes say. Mary and Martha knew Jesus could prevent death. But what is the state of Lazarus? Well, he's now been in the tomb for 4 days. He's rotting. This is why, with the body rotting in a hot climate, Martha is concerned about the smell. Eyewitness stuff. Let's turn over.
So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." What
a picture. So what do the notes say? What can Jesus do about death? Well, with just 3 words, Jesus summons Lazarus from his tomb. Lazarus, come out. What about, he doesn't touch the body, doesn't even go in. He just, Lazarus, come out. Imagine being one of the people unwrapping him as he came out of the grave. See, you've been to the funeral, you've seen the body laid out, you've probably helped the family wrap it, you've carried the body wrapped, and now what should have been a decaying body is unwrapped, and he's perfectly all right. Jesus calls this corpse to life. Jesus proves he is the one who will call every human being who ever lived from their graves. Jesus said that Lazarus' death was for God's glory. Look how clearly God has shown himself, because only God could do this. Right, over the page.
Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here is this man performing many signs.
Oh, what great picture. Therefore, many of the Jews who come to visit Jesus had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. So yes, I get the phone call. Do you remember going to such and such's funeral? Of course I remember. I was there. Okay. Well, I've got news for you. You crossed him out of your diary. He's back alive. Oh, don't be ridiculous. I went to the funeral. No, I'm not kidding. He's alive. So some of them rush and say, Pharisees, you got one heck of a problem. This guy Jesus that you've been dealing with, you've been so uptight about. Well, 2 miles off your doorstep in Bethany, he's gone and brought back Lazarus, whose funeral we all went to. What are you going to do about that? Oh, emergency meeting. That's what we're going to do about that. We're going to have an emergency meeting. So they call a meeting of the Sanhedrin. And what's the topic? What are we accomplishing?
Yes.
Here is this man performing many signs. Now, do you notice not at one point do they say he must be who he claims to be? I take you straight back to chapter 2 and the story of Nicodemus. What did Nicodemus, the teacher of all Israel, say when he turned up at night to see Jesus? He said, we know who you must be. You must be a prophet sent from God, because nobody could be doing these signs. But they're not focusing on the signs or that he could be who he claims to be. They're worried. What are we accomplishing? We're in trouble. That's the message, isn't it? Well, let's go through the notes. This was a very public funeral. It takes place just 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many senior Jews would have been there. They now respond. What do the Jews make of this miracle? Well, many believe, just as Jesus had said. But some report the events to the Pharisees. How do the Pharisees respond? Did you notice that even Jesus' greatest enemies don't accuse him of having faked this? There's not, this must be wrong. There's not, he's pulled a fast one. Instead, they have a crisis meeting. The Pharisees acknowledge this is yet another sign from Jesus, like the healing of the paralyzed man in chapter 5 and the man born blind in chapter 9. And they're worried. So could you just define for us again who the Sanhedrin are?
Yeah, the Sanhedrin, the ruling Jewish council.
So their response, as I said earlier, has revealed what really matters to them. So what are they going to do? Well, let's find out.
If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Then one of them, named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish.
Now, I've been in business meetings like verse 48. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. We've had it. We're toast. We're in trouble. And then what will happen? Well, actually, the worst thing that we could possibly imagine for us, the Romans will come and will take away both our power base, the temple, and our nation. They view it as theirs. They think that they are in control. And the two things that are their power base are the temple and their leadership of the nation. So what comes next? Well, one of Caiaphas stands up. He'd been the high priest that year, And he says, oh, you lot know nothing at all. You honestly, what are you're panicking? What are you doing? You know nothing at all. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die for the people, that the whole nation perish, than that the whole nation will perish. In other words, he says all the right things for all the wrong reasons. Well, let's go through the notes. What are religious leaders bothered about? It's Jesus. If Jesus isn't stopped, everyone will end up following him, which means that the Romans could come and take away their own power base, the temple, which could also lead to the loss of their national identity, which they view themselves as leading. What's the high priest's answer? Caiaphas is utterly dismissive. He says that they are just ignorant. He states that it is better for the Jewish leaders if one man dies for the people to protect the whole nation. The key word in verse 50 is for. This means literally on behalf of. So let's read it again with that. You do not realize that it is better for you that one man die on behalf of the people than that the whole nation perish. Caiaphas thinks that Jesus should die rather than everyone lose out. What a picture. And high priest, could you just define the high priest?
Yeah, head of the Jewish religious system.
Yeah. So again, I say, he says all the right things for all the wrong reasons. Let's move on.
He did not say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. So from that day on, they plotted to take his life.
Well, thank you, John, because that's a very helpful addition in verse 51. Let's just take it line by line. He did not say this on his own. Well, no. So actually, he's used by God. Officially, he's high priest that year, and he ends up prophesying without realizing it, that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation. And actually, then John adds for us, and not only for the nation, but also for the scattered children of God. Yes, so wherever God's people are around the world, that includes you and I, we're going to be brought together and made one. How's that going to happen? It's going to be the cross, actually. It's Jesus dying on the cross. But what's the response of the Jews? So having seen the evidence, having called an emergency meeting, cannot get over the fact that Lazarus is alive, what do they want to do? They want to bury the evidence. So from that day on, they plot to take his life. Well, they've already tried, actually. Yeah. So, I mean, it was a fresh attempt. They want to get rid of him. They're desperate to get rid of him. Let's read the notes. What is actually going on? Well, verse 51 tells us it's a prophecy from God. Without realizing it, Caiaphas, as high priest, predicts the real outcome of Jesus' death. Jesus will die as a substitute for those that put their trust in him. And this isn't just for the Jewish nation, it's for the scattered children of God, bringing unity for all who believe in Jesus. So in other words, this sacrifice is for anyone from anywhere who puts their trust in him. We need to stop and think about this. So over the page, Roger, would you take us through one of our stop and thinks?
Yes, so Caiaphas wants to murder Jesus. However, without realizing it, he prophesies that Jesus is going to die in the place of the people. This is all part of God's plan. His death on the cross would accomplish being right with God, our sins paid for. Jesus' death on the cross brings life with him and his people, family unity with those who put their trust in him. We'll see later in John that the cross pays once and for all for God's justified anger at our sin, brings eternal life for a forgiven people, and is available to all who put their trust in Jesus.
In other words, the cross is going to do exactly what Caiaphas has prophesied. Right, well, let's get back to the story and finish off the chapter.
Therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the people of Judea. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the wilderness, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover. They kept looking for Jesus. And as they stood in the temple courts, they asked one another, "What do you think? Isn't he coming to the festival at all?" But the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who found out where Jesus was should report it so that they might arrest him.
Well, isn't this interesting? And again, detail from somebody who was clearly with him. So Jesus withdraws to a village near the wilderness. We don't exactly know for how long he was there, just that the disciples are there with him, verse 54. And then what time of the year is coming? Well, we're actually at the third Passover. It's nearly the Passover festival, that important time to go to the temple in Jerusalem to be made ceremonially clean before God. This is when people remembered God's rescue through the substitute of a lamb, which died on behalf of the people. So what do we know? Well, we know that Jesus is that ultimate lamb, the Lamb of God, who's come to take away the sins of the world. And what's the chief priest's orders? Well, in fact, they're going to do the exact opposite of what they should be doing, leading God's people. They want him reported so that they can arrest him. They don't want him to be what he is going to be. They want to just get rid of him. They think they can bury the evidence. The hour is drawing near for Jesus, and they've got a completely different view of what that hour will be in terms of an outcome. Let's flip over. Summary, please, Roger.
Yes, Jesus conquers death. As Jesus sees Mary weeping, he's deeply angered and troubled by the death of his friend, verse 33. He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Everyone is watching Jesus, wondering why he didn't save Lazarus, verse 37. Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Even though it contains a rotting corpse, Jesus orders the tomb to be opened, verse 39. There is a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days. And with just 3 words, Lazarus is summoned from death to life, verse 43. Lazarus, come out. Many believe, but the religious leaders are more desperate than ever to remove Jesus, verse 48. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our temple and our nation. Without knowing it, Caiaphas, the high priest, prophesies that Jesus will die on behalf of the nation. Verse 50. It is better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. And the Passover festival is nearly here. Verse 55. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover.
Now, I just want to stress that what we've looked at in these last 2 episodes, you couldn't make it up, could you? It's the exact opposite of what any man would do. He's literally going to allow someone to physically die, something that then we couldn't reverse, so that he can reverse it to show that actually he's victorious and has the control over death. He's then going to use that, the fact that this was a prominent Jew that many had known, had gone to the funeral, and that is just outside of the city limits, so it's only 2 miles from the city, that is then going to be publicly brought back to life. You can't bury that evidence. And yet, what is it that they set out to do? Bury the evidence. You couldn't make it up. There is no hiding the fact that this story, just like the wedding in Cana with that fantastic quantity and quality of wine, just like what happened when he upset the money tables in the temple, just like with the feeding of the 5,000 or with the bringing back from the man who was a paralytic, giving him full movement, or the son of the royal official brought back to life, or the man who's lost his sight. You cannot deny the physical evidence of these miracles and that it supports what he says about himself. It's a very powerful picture. So what will they do next when he's coming up to the Passover? A chance for people to reread, and then we flip over again. And what comes next? The scene is set and Jesus' hour has nearly arrived. So this is getting rather exciting. I do hope people will come back to join you and I, Roger, for episode 23.